Hello the internet, my name is Dean and welcome back to another Ruby on Rails tutorial. Today we're going to be covering the first part in I think a two-part series of setting up an action cable application. This first one's going to be covering essentially creating the user accounts, adding devise with a navbar, making it so we can log in and log out with the navbar, and then creating some messages and updating the chat box from our perspective with some Ajax remote calls so that we can at least see when we post a message into the chat box, but any other messages you'll have to refresh to be able to see them. In part 2, we'll cover using action cable to sort of refresh the application constantly through a persistent HTML connection with the WebSockets that action cable provides, so that whenever you send a message, everyone else sees it, and when anyone else sends a message, you see it immediately. But for now, let's go ahead and let's get started.
Alright, so the first thing we're going to do once we're inside of our application is run a Rails G controller command, and we're going to call this pages, and we'll give it a home action. This will let us set a root for our application. We can then come into our gem file, and below the Ruby, we'll just add in a comment that says begin custom gems. And then we'll say gem devise because we're using it for our user accounts. We'll then add a gem for the Bootstrap, and Bootstrap requires jQuery. It also requires popper_js, and it likes to have tether-rails as well. At the bottom, we'll also say gem simple_form, and we'll save that. We can come back to our terminal and run a bundle command. Now that that's bundled, we can come into config and routes.rb, and we can change this to be a root and pages #home as the action. Now that that's done, let's come into our app assets and our style sheets folder, and let's rename this application.scss file to just be, or application.css file to be an .scss file. We can then open that up, get rid of the comments that are in there, and then we'll just say at import / asterisk, and then at import Bootstrap, and then at import tether. We can save that and close it, and then we can come into our JavaScript application.js file. This first line needs to change from Rails-UJS to jQuery 3. We then want to require Bootstrap. We want to require Popper. There's no JS on the end of this one. And then finally, we'll require jQuery_UJS. And we can save that and close it. We can leave the routes open for now, but we can close the gem file. Now that all that's done, let's go ahead and start running some installers. The first one we'll run is the Rails G simple_form :install command, and we'll give it the Bootstrap flag with a -- Bootstrap call. That'll add the classes we need. The next thing we need to do is run a Rails G devise :install command, and that's going to give us a couple suggestions for what we should do to set up our application. We can skip this first one because we're not doing anything with the emailer. The second one we've already done with the pages controller home action. The third we can do real quick by just copying this. We can come into our views, layouts, and then create a new file. We'll save this as _alerts.html.erb, and we'll paste those in there. Now let's render these from the application file. Above the yield tag, we'll just say render layouts/alerts, and we can save that. Finally, it's telling us to run the Rails G devise views command, so let's go ahead and do that. We'll say Rails G devise :views, which will generate our devise views for essentially all the pages that our users will use. Once that's done, we could run a Rails G devise user command to generate our user model. Then we want to run a Rails G model command to generate a model for our message. We'll give the message a body of type text and a user references. That way we can later display which user posted the message in the chat room. And then finally, let's run a Rails G controller command again to create a messages controller with a create action. Now we're using the create action, but we need to slightly modify the route for this. By default, it's going to create a get route for this. We want this to be a post. We don't want to post to messages/create. We just want to post to two messages. And then we want the messages to redirect to the messages create action. Now that that's done, we should be able to run a Rails db:/migrate command to migrate the database. And then we can run the Rails S command to start the server and hope that things didn't blow up horrendously. If we refresh the page, we should now see that there's some basic styling on the page and an application that's ready for us to start playing with. The first thing we're going to do, as soon as I find out what my cat's up to, the first thing we're going to do is go to Google and search for Bootstrap 4 components, and the first result should be this getbootstrap.com/docs/4.0 result, which is for Bootstrap 4, which is what we're using. Now, this is great because it gives you a whole bunch of Bootstrap stuff to work with, but we want to go to the Navbar page, and we want to grab this first Navbar that has the home and all the links and the search form. So let's hit copy, and then reposition our windows again. Now, what we can do is we can come into our layouts file and create another new file. We'll call this one _navbar.html.erb. We'll paste our navbar code in there, and then we can come into application.html.erb and render the navbar in here. So for this, we'll say render layouts/navbar. And this is great because the alternative to this is to paste in all of your navbar code and completely flood your application file. And we're not doing that. We're just calling one render in here and hiding the rest of it. So if we come back to our home page and refresh, we now have our navbar. So this is where we start to play with things because we have access to the user accounts. So let's come into our navbar and start changing some of the stuff. We'll change this to say chatter for the brand. So if we refresh, we now have chatter right there. We'll leave these links as sort of a reference for now, but let's get rid of this search form because we're not going to be searching anything. So let's remove this search form, save the application, and see what we're working with. Well, that looks good, but we can do better. So let's start by creating a UL tag. We'll give it a class equal to navbar-nav, and instead of mr-auto here, what we want to do is say ml-auto. And the reason for this is this mr-auto is causing everything to get pushed over with a maximum right margin. And instead, we want to have a left margin so that our stuff appears over here on the right. So that's why we're doing the ml-auto. Sorry about that. My cat just decided to declare war on my camera. So we have this UL for the navbar, which is pushing everything over to the right. And inside of this, ideally, we would like to call an if statement that says, if the current user is signed in, which is what this current user does. It says, if the user is signed in, it'll return true. Otherwise, it'll return false, which is what this else statement covers. So just as a bit of a test here, we'll say not signed in inside of this else statement, and you can see that that text appears right there. So right now we're not signed in, so this is the condition we need to deal with. When we're not signed in, we want to have a link to sign up, or maybe we can even say create account. And for this, we want to say new user registration path. And then we also want to have a link to sign in. And for this, we want to say new user session path. And we could save that. If we refresh, we just kind of get these ugly links that don't really have any styling for them. There's a couple reasons for this. The first obvious attempt we could make is to just give this a class. And we could say that this is a nav-link. Now if we do that, we get a bit better, but we can still do even better than this. We can say class nav-link for this one as well. Save that. And then let's also just throw in some LIs in here with class equal to nav-item. Item. And then we can throw this down here and we can do something similar for our sign in. Close that, /li, /li, save that, and refresh the page. So now that things are kind of structured a bit better, let's go ahead and handle the situation where the user is signed in. So for this, we'll hit create account. We'll create an account with some fake information. So we'll say dean@example.com. We'll give it a password of password, and we'll hit password confirmation of password, and then we'll sign in. Now there's nothing over here. What I would like to have over here is a drop-down similar to this one. So for this, I'm going to grab this drop-down. I'll actually just cut it out of there, and I'll paste it inside of the current user drop-down, or inside of the current user check. So when the user is signed in, this code right here is what we want to see. The first thing I'd like to do is change this from drop-down to maybe have the current_user.email. And we can do this because we're already checking if the current user exists, so we'll never have this be nil. So now we have dean@example.com appearing there. That's great, but I don't really care for the way this looks. Now this might seem like it's appealing right here because everything looks like it fits, but if we were to change this to current user.username, which we don't have a method for yet, so if we refresh, we'll get an error. So let's create that real quick. We can do that by coming into models and user.rb, and we'll just create kind of like a stubbed out username. So this won't actually work for logging in, but it's great just for prototyping an application like what we're doing here. So for this, we'll just say return, and we want to return the email.split. We'll split it at the @ symbol. We'll grab the first element of that array and we'll hit capitalize. You can save that, refresh, and we'll be fine. And the way this works is it splits this at, so for example, we have dean@example.com, and this right here was actually a lowercase d. So it splits this into dean, and then it gives us example.com as the second element of the array. So we're grabbing the first element, and then we're just capitalizing it, which just means take the first letter and capitalize it. So that's pretty much all we're doing there, which is why this works. But when we're not using the email, our drop-down menu actually goes off screen and causes us to have to scroll, and it kind of breaks everything. So a really quick way to fix that is to come into our navbar again, go to the li class and find the drop-down menu, and then we'll just say drop-down-menu-right because the drop-down menu is on the right side of the screen. We can refresh the page, and now everything looks okay. So now let's get rid of one of these actions right here, and let's maybe change this one to be a link to, and we'll say edit account, and then we'll say edit_user_registration_path, and we'll give this a class of drop-down -item. And then we can close that link. So now if we click this, we can go to the edit account page. Now, that reminds me, let's actually change this to actually redirect to the root of the application. And we can do this by just actually throwing some Ruby code into our href string right here. So for this, we'll just say root_path. We can refresh the page, hit this, and it takes us back to the root. So now let's click on the drop-down again, and ideally right here, we'd have the sign out button. So let's do that real quick. For this, we can just throw in some more Ruby code, and we'll say link_to sign out, comma, destroy_user_session_path, and a class of drop-down-item. Now this looks good, but this actually won't work, and the reason for that is it'll try to do a GET request, which isn't what we want. What we instead want is the method : to be delete. And then if we refresh and then hit sign out, we can successfully sign out and sign in to our application. So now that all that's done, let's go ahead and close some of these files, and let's open up our pages and our home page. Now for this, I have some code that I'm referencing off screen, which is just some basic styling that I chose to do when I was setting up this application that I'm kind of sharing with you here. For all of this, I pretty much just went to the Bootstrap page and I just looked through everything to figure out what I like. So I usually go with the Jumbotron because it's great for just having some different stuff to go with. And then I also like the input groups, and I'm going to be using this recipient's username one, which is just this second piece of text, or this second piece of code right here. We're going to do we're going to deviate a little bit here. We're going to say style text align center for this header. That way our text is in the center of the screen. We're now going to do a div, and this one's going to have a couple things that we need to set up. We're going to give it a well, and we'll refresh the page. Nothing will happen there, but we also need to give this an ID equal to chatbox, which is important because we're going to be grabbing this ID with jQuery later to actually create them or display the messages on screen after we create them. We'll then give it a style, and we'll do a couple things in here. We'll say 250 pixels. We'll give it a border. We'll say it should be 1 pixel. We'll make it solid 1 pixel, and we'll set the color to be 222, and then we can also give it an overflow -y, and we'll set that to scroll. And once everything's closed off, we can save that and refresh. So now we have our chat box right here, which will be our chat room, and we have a disabled scroll page. So now that that's done, let's go ahead and actually start displaying some messages. Now we don't have any messages yet, and we haven't actually assigned this @messages variable yet, but this is the basic format that we'll want. So we'll say @messages.each do message, then we want to come down here and end this. And then inside of this, ideally we would render a messages partial, which is in the messages folder, and just message. And then we would pass in a reference to this message so that we can work with it. Once all of that's done, we can come down below the chat box and we can start creating our form. So for this, we'll use a new Rails 5 form. We'll say form with model at message, and we also don't have this variable assigned yet, but that's okay. Now for this, we'll do a div with a class equal to input-group and an mb-3, and then we'll give this a f.text_field, _field. We'll give this the body of the message. We'll say placeholder, say something, ... We'll throw in a comma, and then we'll give this a class of form-control, and then we'll close out this Ruby code and come back over. Once that's done, we can then say this needs a div with a class equal to input-group-append. So we're appending this to the input group. And then this just needs to be an f.submit with the text of send and a class of button-primary. And then we can close off this. Once all of that's done, and hopefully we don't have any broken HTML here, which doesn't look like we do, we can refresh the page and run into our first error. Now this is telling us @messages is not working, and the reason is it's nil, because @messages is returning true for @nil, so we haven't even assigned it yet. What a disaster. Let's come into our app controller's pages controller and fix this real quick. So the first one we want to fix is @messages, and we just want to set that equal to message.all. If we refresh the page, that's good, but we don't have our @message yet, so if we just type in some text here, we'll get an error in the console. And the reason for that is we need to say @message equals message.new. And this is the message that we're using inside of our form. Once that's done, we then need to create our actual message partial. So let's come into our messages folder, create a new file, and we'll save this as _message.html.erb. And just as a quick note, I actually made this a primary button. I didn't mean to do that. So let's come into home. Let's change this to secondary and refresh the page. That just looks a little bit better in my opinion. So now in our message partial, we should start with a div and a class equal to well, just because, well, it looks good, pun intended. Now let's start by checking what time the message was created at. So for this, we have a reference to the message, so we can just say message.created_at. And then let's format this with an strf time call. And then inside of this string, we need to create some strf formatting. So let's search for strftime.net, and you can come to this page. Now this page is great because it lets you format your time right here. So we'll start with a 1 to 12 hour time, which looks cool. Then let's add in a colon and maybe add in the minutes. And then we can throw in a space, and then I guess we can just add in an AM and PM call right there. Cool. That looks good. So now we just copy this little bit right here and paste it into our string. We can now add in the username. So for this, we'll say message.user.username and a colon. And then we can just render the message.body. And let's actually make this on a new line so that stuff doesn't get cut off screen. So if we save that, refresh the page, nothing will change because we don't have a message yet. But let's go ahead and create one. So created my first message, woohoo. And we can send that. Now up here you can see that nothing happened, which is interesting. So why did nothing happen? Well, if we come into our messages controller, those of you familiar with some basic CRUD will know that you have to actually create the message in order to create the message, which is a shocking revelation, I'm sure. So let's start by saying @message is equal to message.new and message_params. Now we don't have this message params yet, so let's come down here and create a private area to work in. And we'll say def message_params end. And then in here we'll say params.require, and because we're passing in an entire new message, we can actually require the message and just permit the body, which is how this is working in the @message new. So now what we'll say is @message.user is equal to the current user. And then we can say @message.save. And we can just come up here real quick and say before_action authenticate_user and save that. The final thing to do, if we refresh this page and create a real message, and up here you can see that it was inserted in the messages, so if we refresh the page, the message appears. The final thing we can do is change this create.html.erb file that we're not using inside of our messages folder and rename this to be create.js.erb. We can then get rid of this header and the paragraph, and we can instead throw in some jQuery and grab the chat box with the ID that we established earlier. We can say append, and then let's append some Ruby code by just throwing it inside the string and saying jRender @message. Put a semicolon on the end of it, refresh the page, and say hello world. And it appears in our chat box. So that about does it for the first portion of this tutorial. This is kind of video 1. Video 2 is going to cover using action cable so that if we open up a second window and navigate to localhost port 3000, if we send a message from window 1 and say hello window 2, we would like it to also appear in window 2. Or similarly, when we say hello window 1, we would like that to appear in window 1. And then when we refresh the page, we should naturally see these things and, scroll the page dynamically and all that stuff. But for now, this is it for video 1. Thank you for watching. If you liked this video, remember to like it. If you didn't like it, remember to dislike it so that other people know not to watch it. And I will see you in the next video. So real quick, I was about to edit and I realized that I didn't address something that might become an issue. And instead of responding to it in the comment section, I thought I'd just cover it right here. If you want this chat box to automatically scroll down whenever you refresh the page, you can do that by coming into your JavaScript folder, your pages.coffee. You can rename this to pages.js, and then you can open that up. And then once you're in here, you can do a document.ready with a function with an open brace. And then in here, you can say var messages is equal to, and grab the chat box. You can then do a function init, and inside of that you can do messages dot, I think it's scroll top with a capital T in top. And for this you want to just grab the messages with the 0th element and grab the scroll height of that with a capital H in height. And then down here you just want to say window.set capital T timeout, and you want to call the init function we just made and pass it like 50 so that it waits a little bit. And once that's done, the page will scroll back down whenever you refresh the page. And you can do something similar inside of the create.js if you want it to scroll down to the bottom whenever you send a message. But we're going to be covering sending the messages in the action cable tutorial, which is part 2. So for now, I would just probably leave it like this and just go watch the second episode so that you can just have that functionality working already. But for now, this pretty much does it for this video. Thank you for watching. Remember, if you like this video, like the video, because that helps me. And if you didn't like this video, then dislike it, because that helps other people know not to watch it. If you really like this video, then, subscribe to the channel. I'm putting these out fairly consistently right now. And if you really didn't like this video, then I am so sorry I've hurt you. But for now, thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.